Today we will build a reusable dialog modal component for React and Next.js and look at why managing the state with URL params instead of the useState hook is a good idea. Hello and welcome, I'm Dave. Today we will dive into modal components for React and Next.js, and I'll provide links to all resources in the description below. I'll also provide a link for you to join my Discord server where you can discuss web development with other students, and you can ask questions that I can answer and receive help from other viewers too. I look forward to seeing you there. Before we get started in VS Code, let's cover the goals for today's video, and those goals are to build a reusable dialog/modal component for React or Next.js, to learn the simple difference between dialogs and modals, examine why managing the state of a component with URL params provides benefits over the useState hook, and finally understand one big difference between React and Next.js when you create this reusable component. So let's look at the code we're starting with. You can see I've already started a new Next.js project. Now you can start a new React or Next.js project to use this modal that we're going to create today. Either's fine really, but if you want to follow my code exactly, I recommend Next.js. I'm also going to be using TypeScript and Tailwind. Now, you can see my Next.js project has a products path right over here. Now, inside there, we've got the page.tsx, and you can see this is a very simple page right now. It has a React fragment here that wraps the other elements. We've got a heading, we've got a link back to the home page, and then we've got a section that just has 7 paragraphs of lorem ipsum, just enough so I could scroll the page when we load this up in the browser so you can see the scroll action. Other than that, there's nothing else in the page. Now, when we go to the home page, we can see it has a heading as well, and then it has 2 links. And both of these links go to that products page. But the difference is the first one goes to the products, it says with modal, but we'll have this with dialog or with modal, either one. But it has the URL param in here that says show dialog equal to Y for yes. And other than that, the other link just goes to products. So it goes to the same page, but one is going to display a modal or a dialog, and one will not. So let's start creating our component and make all of this work. We'll do that by creating a new directory, and we're going to call this one components, which is where we would probably store this. And now inside, let's create a component called dialog.tsx. Now this is going to be a client component, so we'll start with use client. After that, let's do a couple of imports. We're going to import use search params. Now this is something we're going to get from Next Navigation. Now in React, you would want to get the search params or any params from the URL in a different way. But I just want to mention that because I'm specifically using Next.js here. But there are of course several ways to get params out of a URL. Now besides that, we need to import useRef and useEffect. And both of those are going to come from React. Now let's set up our props. I'm going to say type props equals our object. It's going to have a title that we can pass in. And now besides that, we're going to pass in a couple of functions. This would depend on how many buttons or clickable things you have inside of your dialog or modal. For this example, I'm going to have 2, so that's how many functions I'm going to have. So I'm going to have onClose, which would be if we click the red X in the top right. And so we'll just say this is a function that has void here. And then we'll also have onOK, which would be clicking the OK button. And this as well will be a function with void for now. Then we'll say children, and this is going to be the children of the dialog. And here we'll have React node, just like you see for children in the layout component here when you see this set up. And here we have children, which is React.React node as well, and we pass those children in the layout component. We'll do the same in this dialog component. Now we're ready to start the component itself, so I'm going to use RFC, which is my ES7 React snippets extension that helps me quickly create a function here. So I've got export default function, and then it says dialog, and that is correct. That's exactly what we want. Now we're going to pass in the title, our onClose, onOK, and children. And now since we've defined props, after that we can just put props Need the S, there we go. And then I'm going to Alt-Z to wrap that down so we can see everything without it scrolling off the page. Now let's create a little bit of room after we've started our function before the return. And we can start here by getting the search params. So we'll say const search params, and we'll set this equal to use search params. And then we're also going to need a ref for our dialog. So here I'm going to say const dialog ref, and we're going to set this equal to use ref. And just to clear up any confusion, I'm going to reference dialog because it's going to be a dialog element, but we can switch this between a dialog and a modal at different times, and we'll discuss that difference. So this use ref could be null, or it could also be HTML dialog element. There we go. And we're going to start with null, and that's specifically why we need it to possibly be null. Then we're going to say const show dialog. We're going to set this equal to search params dot get, and then we can get that show dialog value out of the URL, which would be the param value if show dialog is passed. Now I'm going to set up my use effect that we imported up here. So down below this, we'll say use effect starts with a function. Now inside this function, we're going to have an if statement. So we'll say if show dialog equals, and we'll use strict equals y, which is the value we are passing to say, yes, we want to show the dialog. Then we'll say dialog ref dot current. Now we'll use optional chaining, and we'll say show, and that's just the method we call. Now here is the difference between a dialog and a modal. This would be a dialog that we show. If we want to show a modal, we need to say show modal. So this is the main difference in our code that determines whether we're showing a dialog or a modal, and that's really all there is to it. Now, when we show the action in the browser, actually, the app in action, then I'll show you the difference and what happens in the browser between a modal and a dialog as well. So I'll leave this as modal for now. So we're going to be showing a modal first in our example. After that, we'll have else, and then we'll say dialog ref dot current, once again, optional chaining again, and close. So if it's not y, then we're going to call the close method on the dialog ref, and we're going to put this dialog ref on our dialog element. And now we do have a dependency here in use effect. This is going to be the show dialog value. So anytime this show dialog value would change, that's when we want the use effect function to run. And now we're not going to pass the on close or the on OK directly into our JSX below. Instead, we're going to wrap those in functions here. So now I'm going to say const close dialog, and I'll set this equal to an arrow function. I still like to write arrow functions. And then inside the arrow function, I'm going to say dialog ref, once again, dot current, and then call close after that optional chaining. And then I also want the onClose function. So this onClose function is whatever we want to happen when the dialog or the modal is closed. And of course, this closes the dialog or modal here. So wrapping those in one function that we can then put in our JSX makes sense. Now after that, I'm also going to say const, and I'll call this click OK. Set this equal to an arrow function as well. And inside of here, I'm going to call the on OK. But then after that, I want to call everything that's in the close dialog. So then I'll just have close dialog here to call as well. So I can call both of those, and I'll pass that as click OK. And now I want to scroll for some room, because what we're going to do is define a ternary with our dialog value and then just return the dialog. So I'm going to say const dialog, and this is going to be a JSX.element, or it could also be null. And then we'll set this equal to, now this is the part of the ternary statement that we're checking. Show dialog if it equals the y, once again. So if we are showing the dialog, then we're going to have a value here after the question mark. And this would be the truthy value. If this is true, then dialog will equal this. If not, this is a ternary statement, and we'll just have it equal null. So it will not be equal to anything at that point. Now here, we're just going to return dialog. So now we're just left with what happens when show dialog is actually equal to y, and we want to see the dialog. Going to scroll just a little bit more, and now inside of this ternary, if we want to show the dialog, we'll start with our dialog element. And from there, not the dialog ref, I guess I should have just typed the element as it was, but here I want a ref, and I'm going to set that equal to the dialog ref. And after that, I'm just going to close it out here, but this is going to be our parent element. Now we'll have several divs inside, and I'll explain these as we go. I'm not going to add all of the Tailwind classes as we go. This is not a Tailwind tutorial. I'll come back and add those. But first of all, we want to have a parent div right here. And this parent div is going to contain everything else. So I'm going to end up making it a flex box that is flex column. So everything inside of it will be stacked. So I'm going to have my title bar, and that's going to be in a div. And then after that, I'm also going to have the body of the dialog, and that's going to be in a div. So what's going to happen here is this flex box is going to be a column, and it's going to stack these two. So we have our title bar and then the body. Now our title bar will also be a flex box, but instead of column, it will be flex row, and I'll have everything like justified apart. So the space between, essentially, it will push left, push right. I'll have the title to the left. I'll have the red X to the right. So I'm going to start with the title here, and it'll be in an H1, and I'll just pass in the title value that we've got. Now the red X is going to be a button. So here we'll have our button element, and it's going to have, well, let me go ahead and just create the button element first. And then here I'm going to come down and say this is going to have an on click. We're going to set this equal to the close dialog function that we created up here, right? Close dialog right there. So we want to pass that in and call that if the red X is clicked. Now after that, we should be able to go ahead and close out the button. Now what is going to be on the button? Well, that's going to be the letter X. So you can see that right here. So that would be our red X. I'll come back and add the class names for the styles later. Now the second div is the body. So it's going to hold the children here. So I'm just going to pass in children right there. But now I also want a green OK button at the bottom. So I need to add another div. And now this div is going to be a flex row that I'll set to justify end, which will push my green OK button to the right. So here I'm going to have another button. And inside this button, I'm going to have the word OK, but I need to go ahead and set the on click for the button here as well. And this on click, on click, there we go, set that equal to our click OK function that we defined above. So that's the actual logic to it without all of the Tailwind classes to make it look a little more confusing. But we did set up a div structure here that will allow me to apply the CSS the way I want to with those flex boxes. Okay, and now we're back looking at the same component with all of the Tailwind classes in. Now I'm going to provide this in the source code that's linked in the description for this lesson, but I'm not going to go over all the classes that I applied to create this modal. You can play around with it and of course make it your own. One we can come back to discuss though is the pseudo element backdrop that applies to the dialog element, because that's kind of important when you see that. And that's another thing about telling the difference between a dialog and a modal. So now that we've created this dialog component, let's go back to the page in the products path and apply this dialog to this page. So we'll start off by importing, we'll say import dialog, comes from components dialog. And now we need to use that dialog right here in our component. So we'll start here and we'll say dialog, and it's going to receive a title. We'll set this equal to, oops, I don't even need the curly brackets. I can just use quotes there and say example modal. After that, I'm going to have an onClose function that we haven't defined yet. And then I'm going to have an onOK function that we haven't defined yet. And then we'll go ahead and close that out. Now inside of here would be the children. This is whatever you put in. I'm going to put in a paragraph of lorem ipsum. So this would be in the body of our modal or dialog. So here I'm going to use an Emmet shortcut and just say P, and then put the greater than symbol and type lorem, press tab. It gives us one paragraph of lorem ipsum. So that is the children of our dialog for this component. Okay, and we're ready to discuss the big difference whether you're creating this for Next.js or for React. If you're creating it for React, all of your components are client components, so it's no problem. You could just create the onClose function and the onOK function up here and pass them into the dialog component that's also a client component, and there's no problem. But in Next.js, products is a server component and dialog is a client component. We're going to create the functions up here, but you can't just pass those in as you would expect to, because these would be server functions or server code. You can't just pass in functions created on the server into your client component, because think about this, it's interpreted on the server as Node.js really, and on the client, of course, it's your vanilla.js, what's typically interpreted in the browser that we've known as JavaScript forever. But there is a difference, so we can't just take one and pass it in. Let's go ahead and create these functions first. So I'll say async function, and I'm just going to make them very simple. So I'll say onClose. Now inside of this function, I'm going to say console.log, and we'll say modal has closed. Now, where would this log? This would log on the server because this is a server function. I'm going to just highlight all of that, use Shift Alt and the down arrow, and create another function that is very similar, but this one is onOK. And here we'll just say OK was clicked. So change that to OK was clicked. So two just example functions, but the problem is right now, and you can try this if you want to, if you're using Next.js, just pass these functions in and see the error that Next.js will give you. These won't work. What you need to do is use the new server actions. Now we need to enable this as well in our Next.js config because they're still experimental, but here we can say use server, and then we can pass onClose in, and we can do the same with onOK. So now if you run the code with these, and of course we're going to enable server actions yet in our config or you'll still have a problem. But for now, with this code that we have here, it will be okay as server actions. So let's go to that nextconfig.js file, and here it is. Inside of our next config, we need to enable the server actions. They're under experimental. And then we'll say, well, we have an object, and then we say server actions, and then we just say true. Now we have enabled server actions, and our code will run with us passing those functions down into our dialog that is a client component. Even though these are server functions, they're server actions, and we will be able to call them from inside of the dialog. Now I have a tutorial on server actions, and you should check out that video to learn more about them, because there's things you can and cannot do, and I'm not going to get into all of that because I've already covered it in this other video. So I'm going to link to that in the description as well, and I should have it pop up here on the screen so you could click on it too. Now we should be ready to test out our project. So let's open up a terminal with Control in the backtick, type npm run dev to launch the product. It should start on localhost 3000. There we go. I'm going to hold down Control and click to launch that in the browser. I'll pull up the browser and we will check it out. Okay, we've got our home page with the two links, both linked to that same products page. One will have the modal and one will not. So let's look at it without. And here's our page without. It has 7 paragraphs. I can scroll it just a little bit. As the home title, and it says go to home. That's fine. Now let's look at it with the modal. And now you can see it looks different. The colors behind look different. And then of course, here's our modal. Now, as I talked about how I did the layout, here is that title bar, and I pushed the title to the left and the close button to the right. Then we have the children, which was that one paragraph of lorem ipsum right here. And then down here, I had that other div that was a row, a flex row, and I pushed or justified to the end. So I got my OK button here at the end. So if I click close, it will close. And if I click OK, of course, it will also close. But notice right now, this is a modal. And that changed the color of the background because it used that backdrop pseudo element that we styled as well on the dialog element. That only happens with a modal though. And I can scroll the page, but that's the only other interaction I can do. Everything else I have to click or get rid of the modal. My link up here, go to home, it doesn't turn into a pointer. I can't use it right now. So what I have to do is interact with the modal in one way or the other. I'm going to go ahead and close it. And now the color changed back. Now I can interact with the page and I'll go home. Likewise, let's go ahead and pull VS Code back up here real quick. And we can see our function worked and it logged modal has closed. That was our server action and it ran on the server because this is the terminal for the server. So let's quickly go back to our code because these changes should apply right away. I'm back in the dialog and I'm going to scroll up here to where we have show modal. And I'm going to switch this now. And I'm just going to say show. So that's the show method, and that shows a dialog instead of a modal, and we can look at the difference. So now if we go back to the browser, and if I go to products with modal, this is a dialog. Notice the color behind did not change. I can scroll the page, and I can even interact with the page, and it doesn't prevent me from any of the page interactions. It does show the dialog, but it doesn't make those other changes. So that is truly the difference between a modal and a dialog. So now let's talk about why we want to manage the state and actually control the modal or dialog with a link like we are, instead of using useState inside the modal or dialog. Well, a tweet from Corey House got me started thinking about this, and it all checked out. So users can bookmark or share a link to the open dialog. That's absolutely correct. And of course, if you don't want to use a dialog with that same page, you can eliminate it by just removing the param from the URL. So if a dialog represents a unique location, is what he says, it warrants a unique URL. But imagine you want a page sometimes to have a dialog and sometimes not. This gives you a lot more flexibility this way. And then it says you can use a plain anchor to open the dialog. And that's what we're doing with these links. When we click this and it opens a dialog right there, that's just a plain anchor link. I'm using one in Next.js, but it's still a plain anchor link is what that turns into. And semantically, that's the proper way to do it. So I really like this, and it lets me adapt a dialog where I need to provide it. And some have also mentioned that, hey, they can close the dialog with the back button as well, and they like that too. So overall today, I hope I've helped you create a reusable modal or dialog, and I hope I've also helped you think about that in Next.js when you want to pass in those functions from the server to a client component. It's not as easy as it may seem. It's definitely not like it used to be in React because you're taking server code to the client, so you need to make those server actions. Remember to keep striving for progress over perfection. And a little progress every day will go a very long way. Please give this video a like if it's helped you. And thank you for watching and subscribing. You're helping my channel grow. Have a great day, and let's write more code together very soon.